The wind from the sea clawed at the walls of Pembroke Castle, carrying with it the salt spray of Milford Haven and the chill of January. Inside, in a chamber lit by guttering candles, a girl screamed. 13 years old, her thin frame racked with pain, Lady Margaret Beaufort gripped the sheets, her body shuddering with the labour that threatened to consume her. Midwives whispered prayers in Latin. The physician muttered in French. Servants rushed with basins of water. Each contraction brought her closer not only to death, but also to destiny. For within her womb was a boy who, though frail at birth, would one day wear England's crown. The scene was one of cruelty, wrapped in inevitability. Margaret was scarcely older than a child herself. Her hips narrow, her body unfinished, she had been pressed into this ordeal by dynastic calculation, not love or readiness. Yet this was the way of her age. For noble women, their bodies were not their own. They were vessels through which alliances were sealed, heirs created, and dynasties preserved. On this storm-lashed night in 1457, the grim truth of that reality was etched into her every scream. But Margaret Beaufort was not any noble girl. Her veins carried the blood of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, son of Edward III, and thus a thread of legitimacy that mattered enormously in a kingdom already trembling towards civil war. The Wars of the Roses had not yet reached their full fury, but the lines were being drawn. In such a climate, Margaret's birth, her marriages, and her womb were matters of politics as much as of family. Her journey to this desperate chamber began years earlier. Born around May 1443 at Bletsoe Castle in Bedfordshire, she was the daughter of John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp. John Beaufort had once seemed destined for greatness. He commanded English forces in France during the waning years of the 100 Years' War. But those campaigns turned bitter, ending in failure and disgrace. He returned to England hollow-eyed, burdened by defeat. In May 1444, he was found dead, officially of fever, but rumours whispered suicide or poison. For a noble, death rarely came without suspicion. Margaret was only an infant when she lost her father, but the shadow of his fall lingered. His disgrace tainted her inheritance, making her both vulnerable and valuable. Her mother, the widowed Duchess Margaret Beauchamp, moved quickly to protect the child's future. In the brutal logic of the 15th century, survival meant alliance. By the age of 6, little Margaret was betrothed to John de la Pole, heir to the Duke of Suffolk. It seemed a powerful match, binding Lancastrian blood to one of England's mightiest houses. But politics is fickle. William de la Pole, Suffolk's father, fell from grace after negotiating Henry VI's marriage to Margaret of Anjou and surrendering French territories. He was murdered crossing the Channel in 1450, hacked to death in an act of butchery that horrified England. With his fall, the contract for young Margaret became worthless paper. If the first betrothal collapsed in blood, the second came in calculation. In 1455, at only 12 years old, Margaret was married to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, half-brother to King Henry VI. Edmund's family, the Tudors, were ambitious Welsh upstarts, elevated through the king's favour. His father, Owen Tudor, had secretly married Catherine of Valois, widow of Henry V, a scandalous match that had nonetheless produced sons the king acknowledged and ennobled. For Margaret, marriage to Edmund Tudor bound her tightly to the Lancastrian cause, a union forged not in romance but in necessity. The wedding took place at Bletsoe Castle, the home of her childhood. In the chapel, beneath effigies of Beaufort ancestors, vows were spoken that Margaret could barely understand, let alone consent to. Edmund was in his mid-20s, seasoned in court and politics. Margaret was still dressing in a child's gowns. Yet the marriage was not merely symbolic. It was consummated immediately, as was customary. To modern ears, it rings of cruelty. To Margaret, it was bewildering and terrifying. The body that should have been given years to grow was instead forced into womanhood in an instant. The consequences would be permanent. Within months, her belly began to swell. Whispers spread among her attendants, part awe, part dread. For a girl of 12 to carry a child was dangerous, often fatal. Margaret herself must have sensed both pride and terror. Pride at fulfilling her role as Countess of Richmond. Terror at the changes her young body could scarcely endure. Outside her chamber, the kingdom itself was unraveling. By 1455, the First Battle of St. Albans had already signalled open conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York. Edmund, loyal to Henry VI, was drawn into the chaos. His duties carried him to Wales to put down Yorkist uprisings. There, in Carmarthen Castle, Edmund was captured by Yorkist forces in 1456. Whether he succumbed to plague in captivity or was murdered outright remains a mystery, but by November he was dead. Margaret received the news while heavy with child. Barely 13, she was a widow, pregnant, and exposed in a land splintering apart. It was Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother, who stepped into the void. He took Margaret under his protection and brought her to his fortress at Pembroke Castle, a massive stone stronghold perched on cliffs above the sea. The journey was long and harsh, winter roads clogged with mud and snow, danger from marauding bands whose loyalties shifted daily. Margaret travelled in a litter, each jolt of the rutted track sending pain through her fragile frame. By the time she arrived at Pembroke, exhaustion and anxiety weighed on her like chains. And so, as the year 1457 dawned, the girl who had lost a father, endured a marriage, and buried a husband now faced her greatest trial: childbirth. It was here that history's wheel turned, for the agony that tore through her body was also the birth pangs of a dynasty. On the other side of suffering waited Henry Tudor, the boy who would grow to end the Wars of the Roses and found a royal house whose legacy still resonates. But on that night, no such triumph was certain. There was only blood, screams, and the flickering light of candles fighting against the darkness. The news of Edmund Tudor's death arrived like a dagger to Margaret's heart. She was at Lamphy Palace in Pembrokeshire, a temporary residence where she awaited her husband's return from his campaign. The messenger, soaked from November rain, entered the chapel where Margaret was praying for Edmund's safety. She turned before he spoke. The look in his eyes told her everything. At barely 13, she was widowed, her child still unborn, her protection suddenly gone. In an age when a woman's survival depended on the strength of her male kin, it was a devastating blow. Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother, understood the peril instantly. Margaret was carrying not only his nephew, but also the potential heir to their fragile Tudor line. He took her into his care, not simply out of familial duty, but because the unborn child could prove decisive in the wars splitting England apart. The Lancastrian cause was faltering, but in the womb of a frail girl lay a flicker of hope. The journey from Lamphay to Pembroke Castle was treacherous. Winter had hardened the roads into frozen ruts. Rivers spilled over their banks, and bridges were little more than slick planks of timber. Margaret, heavy with child, was borne in a horse-drawn litter. Each lurch sent pain shooting through her body. Bandits, soldiers, and opportunists roamed the countryside. Jasper's men rode ahead, their eyes scanning the woods, their hands always near their hilts. What should have been 2 days stretched into nearly a week. When at last Pembroke's round keep loomed over the cliffs, the girl inside the litter must have seen not just a fortress, but a cage. Pembroke Castle was formidable, its limestone walls rising above the sea. The waves of Milford Haven battered the rocks below with relentless force, as though rehearsing the torment soon to strike within its chambers. Winter inside was brutal. Drafts whistled through cracks in the stone. Fireplaces devoured wood faster than servants could haul it, and frost gathered on the inner walls. Margaret's rooms were draped with tapestries, yet the cold bit through. She paced when she could, as the physician recommended, but her body was small and fragile, her steps short and halting. Those around her feared the worst. Dr. Lewis Caerleon, an educated physician who had studied both at Oxford and Paris, examined her with a growing sense of alarm. Her hips were narrow, the child large, the position difficult. He confided his fears to Jasper. She is a child herself. Her body may not survive what is to come. In the medieval world, medicine was equal parts science and superstition. He prescribed herbs to ease Margaret's discomfort, prayer to guard her soul, and vigilance against the dangers he could not name. Still, the reality was plain. Nature had been pushed too far by politics. Margaret herself turned inward. She spent long hours in the chapel, her hands clasped until the knuckles blanched, whispering prayers to the Virgin Mary and Saint Margaret of Antioch, patron saint of childbirth. Servants whispered that her devotion was obsessive, but faith gave her something to cling to in a world that had stripped away every certainty. In the dark stone nave, with candles flickering against carved saints, the young widow begged God not to abandon her. When the pains began in January 1457, Margaret was walking the battlements as snow flurried across the courtyard. A contraction seized her so violently she collapsed against the parapet. Her attendants rushed her to her chamber, where midwives, seasoned women, hardened by decades of bringing life into the world, prepared for the ordeal. They burned rosemary for strength and lavender for calm. Knives, hooks, and linens were laid out, grim tools for whatever fate demanded. The air thickened with the smell of smoke, sweat, and fear. For 18 hours, Margaret endured torment. Her screams echoed through the halls, then faded to hoarse gasps as exhaustion stole her voice. The midwives exchanged grave glances. They had seen girls younger than this die, their bodies breaking under the strain. Dame Gwen Furch Dufford, the senior midwife, tried every method, turning the child with skilled hands, urging Margaret to change positions, offering bitter brews to give her strength. Dr. Caerleon hovered, muttering about humours and pulse, helpless against the brute force of biology. Outside, Jasper Tudor paced the corridors, his boots striking the flagstones like a metronome of anxiety. Every scream from the chamber pierced him. He knew that within those walls hung not only the fate of a girl, but of a dynasty. Father Meredith, the castle priest, knelt in the chapel and prayed without ceasing, his whispered Latin rising like smoke toward the vaulted ceiling. At last, as dawn bled pale light through the arrow slits, Dame Gwen made her decision. A risky manual extraction was the only chance. She prayed to St. Margaret and reached into the young woman's body. Margaret, half conscious with pain, clutched the sheets until her nails tore. Then, in a moment that seemed to suspend time, the child slipped free. Silence followed. The infant was pale, limp, seemingly lifeless. The midwives held their breath. Then, after Dame Gwen cleared his airway, a thin, defiant wail rose into the air. Relief swept the room like a tide. Against all odds, a son had been born. Henry Tudor. Margaret, her body shattered, lay pale as linen. She turned her head toward the bundle in the midwife's arms, her eyes wide with desperate love. For a fleeting moment, they placed him on her chest. She memorized his tiny features through a haze of agony, imprinting them on her soul. Then he was lifted away, to be swaddled by the fire. Margaret's eyelids fluttered shut, and she slipped into unconsciousness. The aftermath was grim. The physician noted severe tearing, internal injuries that would never heal fully. "She will not bear again," he whispered. Margaret's one child would be her only child. Fever racked her body for weeks. Infection hovered like a vulture. Broths, tinctures, and whispered prayers kept her alive. Dame Gwen tended her without rest, spooning liquids into cracked lips, cooling her brow with damp cloths. Slowly, agonizingly, the girl clung to life, yet the ordeal had changed her forever. Her body, permanently damaged, betrayed the cost of dynastic ambition. Her soul, however, emerged tempered like steel. Nightmares haunted her, dreams of blood and suffocation, but from them grew a fierce conviction that her suffering must have meaning. She poured herself into devotion, fasting, praying, studying scripture with a zeal that unsettled even her confessors. To Margaret, survival was no accident. God had preserved her for a purpose. That purpose lay in the fragile infant who wailed at the firelight, a boy destined to bear the weight of her sacrifice. From the blood-soaked chamber of Pembroke, the story of Margaret Beaufort shifted. No longer just a pawn of marriages, she was now mother to a potential king. The girl's screams had summoned not just a child, but the faint spark of a dynasty. Margaret Beaufort never fully recovered from that first childbirth, but the kingdom allowed her no respite. Barely months after delivering Henry, her family moved to secure her place in the shifting order. At just 14, she was married again, this time to Sir Henry Stafford, younger son of the Duke of Buckingham. Unlike her union with Edmund Tudor, this marriage was not forged in the heat of dynastic desperation, but in the quieter logic of stability. Stafford was no great prize in bloodline, but he offered something Margaret desperately needed: protection. The wedding was modest, stripped of pageantry. Margaret, still weak and pale, stood beside her new husband in vows that sounded less like poetry than like contract terms. To her, Stafford must have seemed distant, almost alien. Yet she understood the necessity. Her son's future, and her own survival, demanded alliances wherever they could be found. And so, she adapted, again. Henry Tudor, meanwhile, remained under the guardianship of Jasper Tudor in Wales. Pembroke Castle became his nursery, its sea-battered walls both prison and fortress. Margaret saw him only occasionally, sending gifts and carefully written letters. Her separation from her only child cut deeply, but it was the safest arrangement. Jasper was fiercely loyal and would protect the boy as his own. Margaret had no illusions about the dangers. A Lancastrian heir, even an infant, was a target. In Wales, Henry's childhood was simple by noble standards, but rigorous. Jasper ensured he learned not just the refinements of court, riding, dancing, music, but also the harsher lessons of survival. He spoke Welsh fluently, hunted in the hills, and watched men whose loyalty was born not of royal decree, but of respect. These experiences, far removed from the gilded halls of London, gave the boy a resilience that would later serve him well. For Margaret, the years of her marriage to Stafford were marked by learning. She began to master the intricate responsibilities of an estate mistress. Ledgers passed through her hands. She studied accounts, rents, and the careful balancing of obligations. Where once she had been a pawn, now she sharpened herself into a player. She read law and scripture, histories and chronicles, building a mind capable of maneuvering through the chaos that enveloped England. And chaos it was. The Wars of the Roses had erupted fully, plunging England into bloodshed. In 1455, the First Battle of St. Albans had cracked the kingdom open. By 1461, the field of Towton turned snow into rivers of blood. It was the bloodiest day ever fought on English soil. An estimated 50,000 clashed, and by dusk, nearly half lay dead. There, beneath sleet and sky, the Lancastrian cause was broken. Henry VI fled. Edward of York seized the crown as Edward IV. The White Rose triumphed over the Red, for the moment. For Margaret, the consequences were immediate. Her Lancastrian blood, once a source of pride, now marked her as dangerous. Her infant son Henry, hidden away in Wales, represented a living threat to Yorkist legitimacy. Yet her marriage to Stafford shielded her. The Staffords leaned toward Yorkist sympathies, giving her protection through political ambiguity. Margaret understood the necessity of wearing masks. Her public posture was loyal, pragmatic. Her private heart remained Lancastrian. In these dangerous years, she also discovered the power of networks built by women. While men clashed on the battlefield, women exchanged letters, tokens, and whispers that carried as much weight as swords. Margaret cultivated ties across factions. She corresponded with Elizabeth Woodville, Queen to Edward IV, even while maintaining lines of communication with Margaret of Anjou in exile. To live in treachery was to walk a knife's edge. A misplaced word could mean death, but silence could mean isolation. Margaret walked the edge with care. The rhythm of her days oscillated between estate management and secret vigilance for her son. She bribed clerks for news from Wales, paid merchants for scraps of rumour, and devised elaborate codes for her letters. Some she wrote in Latin, some in French, some with invisible inks that revealed themselves only under heat. Gifts were chosen with subtlety: a book of saints' lives for her son, a cloak woven in her household colours, a rosary carved with hidden symbols. Each token was a mother's love wrapped in strategy. In 1469, Henry Stafford was wounded fighting at the Battle of Edgecote, a clash that pitted rebel forces against Edward IV. A deep cut to his thigh festered, leaving him permanently weakened. Margaret nursed him through the long recovery, tending to him as carefully as she had once tended her infant son. Yet illness brought bitterness. Stafford had served York loyally and received little reward. Margaret, ever observant, began to nudge his loyalties. She did not speak openly. Such frankness was dangerous. Instead, she planted seeds. Stories of Yorkist corruption, murmurs of ingratitude, gentle reminders of neglected service. Slowly, Stafford began to turn, his wounded pride fertile ground for doubt. These were the years in which Margaret transformed. She was no longer merely a survivor of misfortunes thrust upon her. She was learning to shape her world, cultivating influence with patience and precision. She did not yet command armies or dictate policy, but she knew the weight of words, the pull of networks, and the quiet leverage of information. Her son was still a boy in Wales, but already she was weaving the web that would someday place him on a throne. As the decade waned, the war was far from over. Edward IV sat uneasy on his throne, the Lancastrians broken but not extinguished, discontent smouldering across the realm. Margaret watched, waited, and planned. She had learned that the wheel of fortune never ceased turning. And when it turned again, she intended to be ready. The year 1470 brought one of those astonishing reversals that made the Wars of the Roses resemble the turn of a gaming wheel rather than the governance of a kingdom. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the so-called Kingmaker, broke with Edward IV and allied with his old enemies, the Lancastrians. It was a strange marriage of convenience. Warwick had once placed Edward on the throne, but now, disillusioned, he joined with Margaret of Anjou to restore the hapless Henry VI. For Margaret Beaufort, this sudden tilt was a miracle. The Lancastrian cause flickered to life. She dared to imagine that her son, Henry Tudor, might once again walk the halls of power under a restored Lancastrian monarchy. When Henry VI was led from the Tower and paraded as king in London, Margaret attended court, her face schooled into piety, her heart racing with hope. Yet she also saw clearly what many missed. Henry VI was a broken man. Years of captivity and illness had left him bewildered, barely aware of the events swirling around him. Margaret watched him during the ceremonial services. His lips moved in prayer, but his eyes were vacant. The crown had been restored to a ghost. Hope proved fleeting. In April 1471, Edward IV returned from exile with Burgundian gold and hardened mercenaries. At Barnet, Warwick fell in a morning fog, his lifeless body stripped on the field. 2 weeks later, at Tewkesbury, the Lancastrian line was crushed forever. Prince Edward of Westminster, Margaret of Anjou's only son, was cut down. Whether in the melee or by execution afterward remains debated. Shortly after, Henry VI himself died in the Tower, almost certainly murdered. The Lancastrian dynasty was extinct. Except, that is, for a thin, tenuous thread, young Henry Tudor, Margaret's boy in Wales. He was 14, his claim complicated and distant, but in a world where direct heirs had been annihilated, even a tenuous claim became dangerous. Edward IV knew this, and Jasper Tudor knew it too. With Yorkist forces tightening their grip, Jasper made the desperate choice to flee into exile with his nephew. It was a storm-lashed September night in 1471 when Henry Tudor boarded a ship at Tenby. Wind tore its sails, waves battered the hull, and on shore, Yorkist soldiers closed in. Margaret was not there. She received the news days later. Her only son had left England, bound for Brittany, perhaps never to return. She could not know if she would ever see him again. The grief was unimaginable, but with it came resolve. If she could not protect him by her presence, she would protect him with her cunning. That same year, her husband Henry Stafford died, worn down by the lingering effects of his war wound. His death freed Margaret to maneuver anew. At nearly 30, twice widowed, she faced the most important decision of her life: whom to marry next. Safety alone would not suffice. She needed influence, power, a partner who could cloak her dangerous loyalties while extending her reach. Her choice was Thomas Stanley, Lord Stanley, one of the shrewdest men in England. The Stanleys were masters of calculated neutrality, switching sides only when the outcome was certain. They commanded troops in the northwest, controlled vast estates, and knew how to survive. For Stanley, marrying Margaret brought the prestige of Beaufort blood. For Margaret, the alliance opened doors into the heart of Yorkist politics. Their union was pragmatic, not romantic, but it was precisely the shield she required. The wedding was marked by elaborate feasts, tournaments, and a careful show of loyalty to Edward IV. The king himself attended, perhaps calculating that it was safer to keep Margaret where he could watch her than to drive her into rebellion. Yet beneath the pageantry, Margaret and Stanley struck a bargain. She would retain her Beaufort estates and freedom to pursue her son's interests, while he gained prestige and political advantage. It was a partnership of equals in ambition, if not in affection. For a time, the arrangement worked. Margaret survived the purges and reprisals of Edward IV's later reign, cloaked by her husband's loyalty. She built networks quietly, gathering information through servants, merchants, and clerics. Letters were sent abroad to Brittany, disguised in codes and symbols, keeping fragile contact with Henry. Each message was a lifeline across the sea, though months often passed without reply. The not knowing gnawed at her. Was he safe? Was he healthy? Was he even alive? Then came 1483. Edward IV died suddenly at just 40, leaving his 12-year-old son as heir. A boy king required a regency, and in the scramble for power, Edward's brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, struck ruthlessly. The young king and his brother were taken into the Tower of London and vanished, their fates whispered about but never proved. Richard declared himself King Richard III. His coronation was gilded, but suspicion clung like smoke. Few doubted he had removed his nephews. For Margaret Beaufort, Richard's usurpation was both peril and opportunity. With the princes gone, Yorkist legitimacy crumbled. Suddenly, her exiled son, remote, obscure, but undeniably of Lancastrian blood, looked like a plausible alternative. The thought was audacious. Could Henry Tudor return and claim the throne itself? Margaret began to act with breathtaking boldness. She allied with disaffected Yorkists, including the Duke of Buckingham, and worked with Bishop John Morton to coordinate rebellion. The plan was astonishing. Simultaneous uprisings within England, while Henry invaded from Brittany to claim the crown. It required flawless timing and immense resources. She risked everything, but rebellion is a fragile thing. In October 1483, betrayal cracked the plot. Henry's fleet was scattered by storms, uprisings fizzled, and Richard struck back with ferocity. Buckingham was executed, conspirators hunted. Margaret herself was placed under house arrest and stripped of her titles. Only her marriage to Stanley saved her from death. Yet, even confined, Margaret was not defeated. She smuggled letters, bribed guards, and continued her correspondence with Henry. Every setback only hardened her resolve. She had survived childbirth that should have killed her, widowhood before adolescence, and decades of war. Now, with England weary of bloodshed and Richard's legitimacy in tatters, she saw the glimmer of destiny. The girl who had once screamed in agony at Pembroke was now a woman who plotted to place her son upon the throne. The stakes could not have been higher, nor the risks greater. But Margaret had learned the art of patience. History, she believed, was moving toward her son, and she would be ready to seize the moment when it came. The years after Buckingham's failed rebellion were years of waiting. Richard III ruled uneasily, his crown heavy with suspicion, while across the Channel, Margaret Beaufort's son lived in exile at the court of Duke Francis II of Brittany. Henry Tudor was no longer a child. He grew into a quiet, cautious young man, educated in the disciplines of both nobility and survival. Margaret followed every scrap of news with a mother's desperation. She paid informants, bribed merchants, and treasured each coded letter smuggled across the sea. The words were often sparse, but they were proof of life. Richard's usurpation had weakened Yorkist legitimacy irreparably. Whispers multiplied. The princes in the Tower were gone, perhaps murdered. The usurper was a tyrant cloaked in royal robes. In this climate, Henry Tudor's distant claim began to shine with unexpected brilliance. Lancastrians saw him as their last hope. Disillusioned Yorkists eyed him as a convenient alternative. Margaret, ever watchful, began weaving alliances with breathtaking audacity. Through Bishop John Morton and other agents, she helped plan an invasion. It was a gamble of staggering scale, raising money, securing ships, coordinating sympathizers in England, and persuading her husband Thomas Stanley to lend his immense influence. Though Stanley, characteristically cautious, gave no guarantees. Margaret understood her husband's nature better than anyone. He would never commit until the outcome was certain. Yet, she also knew that his hesitations could be turned into leverage at the right moment. By the summer of 1485, the hour had come. Henry Tudor landed at Milford Haven on August 7th, accompanied by Jasper Tudor and a small but disciplined army of French mercenaries and loyal exiles. From there, they marched inland, gathering support, village by village, castle by castle. Wales remembered the Tudors, and men trickled into Henry's ranks. Margaret, under house arrest, could not be with him, but her years of clandestine preparation rippled through the countryside. Letters she had sent, promises she had made, bore fruit. The march led inexorably to Bosworth Field in Leicestershire on August 22, 1485. Richard III, armoured in glittering steel, commanded a larger force. His banners, bore rampant, snapped in the wind. Henry's army, smaller and less experienced, faced annihilation. Yet hovering on the sidelines were the Stanley forces, thousands strong, commanded by Margaret's husband and stepson. Their allegiance was the question on which everything turned. The battle was savage, fought in mud and smoke. Richard, no coward, charged directly at Henry, determined to end the pretender with his own hand. Chronicles say he fought like a lion, cutting down Henry's standard-bearer and almost reaching the young exile himself. But then came the decisive moment. The Stanleys moved. Whether through prior arrangement with Margaret or last-minute calculation, their troops surged against Richard. Surrounded, the king fell fighting, crying, "Treason! Treason!" His body was hacked down in the mire, his crown plucked from the thorns of a hawthorn bush and placed upon Henry's head. The boy born amid screams at Pembroke was now King Henry VII. The Tudor dynasty had begun. For Margaret, the triumph was both vindication and transformation. She became My Lady the King's Mother, a title unprecedented in English history. At court, she held near queenly authority, yet carefully balanced humility with power. She signed documents in her own name, maintained her estates, and advised her son in governance. It was said that, in her household, men dined silently if she wished it so. Such was her presence. Yet she never forgot the cost. Her body had been broken in girlhood, leaving her unable to bear more children. Her motherhood had been lived largely in absence, her son raised by others, seen only through rare visits and fragile letters. But the iron will forged in pain had carried them both to triumph. She had traded youth, health, and happiness for dynastic survival, and she had won. Henry VII secured his throne by marrying Elizabeth of York, uniting Lancaster and York at last. Their union symbolized the end of 3 decades of war. From their line would come Henry VIII, Mary I, Elizabeth I, the rulers who shaped the destiny of a kingdom. All of it traced back to Margaret's endurance in that cold chamber at Pembroke. In her final years, Margaret devoted herself to education and faith. She founded colleges at Cambridge, endowed scholarships, and left a legacy of learning that endured beyond politics. When she died in 1509, just days after her grandson Henry VIII's coronation, she was buried in Westminster Abbey beneath a magnificent tomb designed by the master sculptor Pietro Torrigiano. On the black marble, an inscription praised her piety and wisdom, but stone cannot capture the echo of her life. The scream of a child forced to give birth, the silence of exile, the whispered prayers in freezing chapels, the secret letters smuggled across borders. Margaret Beaufort's story was not of gentle motherhood, but of iron ambition wrapped in devotion. She transformed suffering into strategy, and through that, alchemy ended a civil war and founded a dynasty. The girl at Pembroke had become the matriarch of England's future.